Hello again. We are live from the LinkedIn Hub at Advertising Week, and with me is Robert Horler. He's the CEO at Dentsu Aegis Network. Robert, I mean, you're someone who kind of interfaces with so many different aspects and elements and companies within your network of this whole industry, of this whole field. So you must have an interesting perspective kind of looking at it from that convergence point. So let's talk a little bit first about this idea of the convergence and this idea of the different pieces now needing more than ever to be connected.
So, I mean, if you look at it from an advertiser point of view, on the one hand, it's never been better. More opportunity and more platforms to reach your target audience, your consumers. More data available to measure the effectiveness of the advertising you'll send to those consumers. More opportunity to connect everything so you can understand the consumer journey. You know, yada, yada, yada. So that's the good bit, right? The not so good bit is that makes it really, really complicated. So it's also becoming increasingly difficult to get cut through because consumers are bombarded with advertising. And it's also difficult, it's actually much more difficult than it should be probably, to connect all those data things seamlessly and then to start optimizing and reacting in terms of your advertising to make it more relevant for your consumers. So on the one hand you have more opportunity, on the other hand it's much more complex, and those two create quite a bit of friction, and the challenge is how you kind of break that friction down in the system and make it more accessible and deliverable for clients to go to market.
You brought up the consumer's journey, and one of the main things we've been talking about a lot with advertisers throughout this week of interviews is the idea that the journey for the consumer is no longer linear and is no longer as easily predictable. I mean, with their continuous access to information, it becomes very random almost.
It is.
So how do you work on that? How do you deal with that challenge of trying to make sense of their journey?
I mean, it depends what you are doing as a business, okay? But you're right, it is more random. It is difficult to... I think it's a very dangerous thing to talk in absolutes, right? So I do get nervous. I always have, but especially these days when people say things like, clients want this. Right. And I'm like, well, which clients? Coca-Cola versus Uber, discuss. I mean, they're different clients, right, doing different things. So I think you do have to acknowledge that, you know, advertisers are trying to do different things, and consumers are more difficult to tie down. But to my earlier point, there are lots of things around technology, ad tech, the sophistication of planning, the way in which you can deliver content. There's lots of tools, triggers, devices, platforms that you can use to map that consumer journey, and there's more data that has been more accessible than it's ever been to track and measure the effectiveness, and you're much more able, particularly in digital channels, to take that information and optimize and change what you're doing in real time. But as I said earlier, it is complex and it's not easy to do, and we are chasing more and more sophisticated audiences, and certainly it's a very dangerous thing to talk in general terms.
So you mentioned data, and obviously big data is the big thing.
The big thing.
So, how do you think big data? You know, I sit down with people and they're like, big data has made life wonderful. We now know everything. You know, it's so great. We can figure out everything. And then you sit down with other people who are like, so we have all this data, but we're not using it right. We don't get everything right. It's very inefficient. It's very expensive. So what are your thoughts on this whole situation?
Well, I tend to agree with the latter part of what you've just said. So I think the honest truth about big data is it has yet to really deliver. I think we need a shakedown in ad tech. We need some consolidation in that sector. I think there are too many agencies and clients who are operating in silos and are using multiple technologies and different data sets, and they're not connecting them as well as they need to. And I actually think that is the next 18 months, 2 years, you'll see a lot of progress made in that space. At the moment, I think the potential for big data is enormous. The promise of big data is really compelling. The reality of big data has been so far quite disappointing. So I think it will get better, and I think
like everything else.
And I think you have to be realistic about where we are on that journey. I think data at the heart of a lot of consumer advertising.
Tell that to the data people.
Well, but to be fair to some of those data people, they've been doing it a lot longer. But as they've sold their products into businesses and as their products proliferate, they've got to be realistic about companies, marketers, advertising agencies. They're not as proficient in the use of data as those companies are, and they're going to take some time to get their head around it and understand what they need and to embed that data and those technologies into their businesses and into their processes. It takes a bit of time.
Another point of friction you mentioned to me, and you call it kind of the friction in the system, is the idea of there's a huge amount of innovation, and then there's also the way that advertising is being bought and sold.
Yes.
So obviously, things are moving fast and everything, and finding kind of a symbiotic or seamless relationship is not the easiest thing. So let's talk about that particular point of friction as you see it.
So if you take my example for a moment, so I've just arrived in the US. I mean, I've done business in the US before, I visited the US, but I've never worked in the US. I've been here for 4 months. So you come to America and you come to the US media marketplace, and the first thing that hits you is it's huge, it's enormous, right? Bit of an obvious thing to say, but it is. And then the second thing that hits you is there's an enormous amount of innovation on the product side and on the media owner side. Just an awful lot of it, almost a limitless amount of it. And then you get into the complexities of the nuances of how media is bought and sold, and you're like, oh, actually, it's not very innovative at all. So my observation coming into the market is product and platform and device, tons of innovation. Actually, the process of how we all work together, not very innovative at all. And I think that is something that will have to change. And I think there'll be a number of drivers, data we've talked about. Programmatic, as it moves from digital into traditional media, is going to drive a sea change in how advertising is bought, and that in itself is going to break down friction in the system. But I think in simple terms, there needs to be much more innovation in the way that advertising is bought and sold in the US, and I think it definitely needs to move much faster to what I call audience-based trading and move away from what I call channel-based trading, which is where I think a lot of the market remains today.
You bring up programmatic and obviously, the automation of the buying and selling process, and once again, I'm going to have to say that the people I sit down with who do that for a living will tell you that it has actually become incredibly, efficient and incredibly wonderful. But, I tend to want to think that I can't see how that's quite there yet, right? So
it's not quite there yet.
Yeah.
So I mean, you're right. I mean, you can always make a case for. Look, first of all, let's go back a step. Programmatic in the US is scaled. It's here. It's big. It's growing rapidly, and for a number of years, probably at least 2 or 3 years, it's been a fundamental part of the sort of media planning ecosystem. That's not true in other parts of the world, but in the US it is.
Oh, wow. Uh-huh.
And it is definitely going to be all pervasive, and all media, to a greater or lesser extent, over the next 3 to 5 years will become digital. So programmatic is definitely, here, it's definitely important, and it's definitely growing. But like anything, and to your point, it's not quite as simple as, if you're a pure play programmatic business, there are huge challenges with, efficiencies, with competition, with transparency, with all the good stuff that is going to come up time and again. There's a lot of stuff still to be fixed. And what I would say is programmatic is not a silver bullet.
No.
Ad tech alone, or programmatic technology alone, or programmatic media buys alone will not deliver what you need. You still need human beings involved in that, albeit human beings with different skills and different capabilities. It's a bit of a cliche, but they're on their journey. But yeah, as a generalist with a media agency, creative agencies and digital advertising agencies in our portfolio business, programmatic is important, but it's not the only thing, right? And it's not going to change everything. But it will be a very powerful driver of change and innovation in all advertising, and that is not to be underestimated.
I very much appreciate your perspective as someone who has just come from, the UK, and I know the advertising world there is significantly different and significantly smaller, as you were saying. But on that same note, it kind of gave me an idea for something I'd like to ask you about, because you did a panel on millennials.
Yes.
And I've spoken to so many people on millennials. Do we understand them? Do we not? We understand 42%, and we don't understand 48, 58,
There's a lot of them as well, isn't there?
Right, there is a lot.
It seems like a very broad church to me, but hey.
So I want to kind of get your perspective. Once again, as someone coming over and seeing it. First, I'd like to know, do you think millennials here in the U.S. are different in their habits, their trends, their wants, etc., than millennials in other places, say in Europe or the UK? And secondly, your observation on that. I mean, everyone has a different observation on what millennials are. I had someone sit with me today and say, how are millennials any different than any other youth generation? So.
Okay, so let's start at the end.
Okay.
So I think they are different.
They are.
I think they are different to every other young generation in some respects. And what I think is, I think their aspirations, their motivations, their mindsets, their opportunities are all different. And I don't think you can be dismissive of that. And I think for advertisers and marketers, and that's just one subset of culture, you ignore that at your peril. So I think they are fundamentally different, and their motivations are different. Do I think they're different here, millennials, as they're classified? In terms of other countries, no, probably not actually. I think there are many commonalities that you would see between a millennial, in Asia, in Germany or in the US, in terms of their mindset. You've obviously got national characteristics that come
culture,
through.
Yeah.
So maybe there are cultural differences, but maybe not mindset differences. And my other observation here is people talk, and this isn't a criticism, it's an observation. People here talk about millennials a lot. In the rest of the world, they acknowledge the concept of millennials, and they talk about the millennial generation and the behaviours and the motivations, to your earlier point. But they don't talk about it incessantly like they do here. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, I think that's interesting, and maybe that's just the nature of the market here and the fact that people are a bit further into trying to understand them. But I don't think I've been in a meeting, honestly, or a panel, or a conference, or a client meeting where the word millennial has not been used.
Yeah. I don't think I've had an interview where the word
right,
millennial.
there you go. So, and that's not the case, certainly, and I've worked in other European markets as well. It doesn't quite bubble up to the level that it does here.
Robert, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I hope you're enjoying your time here, and I hope you're not
great.
too overwhelmed by this advertising.
It's all very exciting.
Yes, thank you so much.
Very nice
Enjoy
to
the
meet
rest
you.
of advertising.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.